Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much. Is everyone still awake? We're on the home stretch. Thanks for your time. Thanks for being here. So next up, we are talking about an issue that almost everyone's experienced. It's how do we get users to adopt Jira, embrace it, and love it as much as we all do. So presenting with us today is Alex Christensen, who is the lead Suite Atlassian engineer at AppDynamics. He basically runs day-to-day use and configuration of Jira, Confluence, and Bitbucket alongside his dog, Max. And I should say he is coming to us from Texas, so just mentally prepare yourself to hear the word y'all several times over the next 30 minutes. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Alex to the stage.
Thank you, Laura. I wouldn't say I'm full-blown Texan. I don't really have the accent, as you can probably tell. But I do say y'all a little too much, probably unhealthy, but whatever. Thank you all so much for coming today. I really appreciate you coming out. So today I want to talk to you about change. Change happens to us every day, from literally having to change your clothes, all the way to big life events like moving into a new house and changing your whole environment. For the most part, most of these changes are really small, and we can adapt to these changes pretty easily. But what happens when we're forced into a change that we don't want? I remember being a young kid and just being the pickiest eater ever. My three food groups consisted of Pop-Tarts, pepperoni sandwiches, and yes, it was just bread with slices of pepperoni on it, which is exactly what it sounds like, and then microwavable pizzas, which didn't have pepperoni on it because I only liked them on the pepperoni sandwiches. And this continued for probably too long and all the way into my college life, where it's actually probably still acceptable, but that's not the point. So for one reason or another, I was actually terrified of trying new foods. Pepperoni on my pizza? Oh no. I think I literally thought of the new and weird foods, like the one you see here, would harm me in some way. I started to realize what a hindrance this was on my social life. I'd go out to eat with my friends, and the only things that sounded good were on the kids menu. My dating life turned out okay. My girlfriend's here. Hey, babe. But it didn't really go very well when I would be just eating the endless breadsticks at Olive Garden whenever I took out a date. So while I was open to changing my eating habits, so I can no longer give off the appearance of appearing like I'm a toddler, I was still really reluctant to try new things. Thankfully, I was surrounded by really good people and good friends to help introduce me to these new things very slowly, and I couldn't be more thankful. Food has actually become one of my favorite things to try. We now have a weekly date night where we go out to our local sushi place. Actually, it just closed. I just thought about that. That's sad. For one reason or another, changing my eating habits wasn't the easiest thing for me in the world. I didn't have trust in food, and I thought I was doing just fine with the food choices I was already making. So as we say back in Texas, atop the horses we ride to work, change ain't easy, y'all. I brought a lot of reluctance to the dinner table, but I also had a lot of patient and helpful people along the way to help guide me and expand my horizons. So with that in mind, let's dive into actually what I want to talk about today, which is advocating adoption for Jira. Jira is one of my favorite tools I use in my day-to-day life. I know the UI like the back of my hand. I'm that guy during a WebEx presentation who wants to do a screen share meeting and try to navigate Jira without touching my mouse. Is anyone else here like that too? No? Cool. There's a few of us. Nice. Represent. Now I got to this point, because I've been using this tool for 6 years. So a lot of this learning just happened naturally over time since I'm in the tool every day. But what about people who don't use this tool every day? What about onboarding new team members? And what about people who have committed the forbidden sin of never hearing of Jira or Atlassian altogether? The hardest part about being a Jira admin for me has been adoption. I think the same can be said really for any tool. It doesn't have to be Jira. It can be for anything. No one wants to take the time to learn a new tool, especially if they have their own processes and tools that they've already been used to. Introducing a new tool to new employees or even current ones can be really difficult. There's a lot of new processes to learn. For your company that grows rapidly, it's hard to document all those changes all the time. You might also have to fight preconceived biases or opinions of a tool like Jira because maybe it was administered poorly somewhere else or had bad configuration design as well. So as a Jira admin, I've learned a lot firsthand about what people respond to, what they find challenging or difficult to understand about Jira. And we at AppDynamics have been really able to hone our adoption strategies to know what works and what doesn't so far. These strategies have actually helped us to, and one of our goals is to unify us under like one tool set. If it's any indicator, we've actually had a lot of teams coming to us internally because they've heard about the great things we've been doing with others in AppD just using Jira. Like for example, we've had our marketing team who's actually been using Asana for a couple of years. They actually came to us because they heard about all the great things we were doing in Jira to track work instead of just going their day-to-day on Asana. So that's been really cool. So to help demonstrate and kind of show you some of our specific strategies, I'm going to run through a scenario that happens to us pretty often. Let's say a new team wants to start using Jira and they want a new Jira project. My team runs Jira, so how do we guide them to use Jira to interact with my team and actually put in that request? They might have some specific requirements, but a lot of people who are new to Jira, they might not know what they want or need, and that's totally okay. So after that, then I'll show you a lot of the default configurations that we put into place in our new projects to make Jira as easy to use as possible. Many of these configurations that you see are possible using out-of-the-box functionality, but we do use a lot of apps from the Atlassian marketplace as well. And just for some additional context, we do use Jira Data Center, so that might affect some of the things that you see here. And to close things out, I'll open us up for questions at the end. So to start us off, let me show you how we guide users to create a new project in Jira. So this is our first chance as a team to lead by example and demonstrate how the tool can be used to our advantage. So here, if you're familiar with Jira, which I hope all of you are, this is our create screen that you see here in Jira. In our team's project, we have quite a few issue types. And a long list of issue types to people outside of our team is probably daunting. We also don't think that we should require people outside of our team to learn all of our team's processes and choose the right issue type. So we actually have like workflow validators on the create transition in our workflow to prevent users from having to choose the right issue type. Everyone outside our team can only create two issue types that you see here, so escalation and new feature. Once the issue is created, we'll then take care of moving it to the right place, the right people, et cetera. And we take the onus off of the reporter, and we take that just to allow someone to get the request in. In our team's philosophy, it's better to get the request in than to not get it at all. So to actually implement this, you can either use a built-in workflow validator based on whether or not a user has a specific permission, and have a separate workflow for each of the issue types you don't want end users to create. But in our case, we have a shared workflow across all these issue types. So I created a scripted validator using script runner on the create transition. So if the issue type is not an escalation or a new feature, and the user is not in the team project role for our project, the validation returns false. Another helpful thing here is the message custom field brought to us by the Jira Toolkit plugin. This custom field allows us to place HTML into the field, and it helps us to display help text on the page for the user. So in our instance, this helps our users know that they can only create new features or escalations in our project before they go fill out a whole form on an issue type they're not allowed to create within our project. A couple of the things that we do on our team's create screens is to limit how many fields appear, and then on top of that, how many of those fields are actually required. Going with our philosophy of actually just making sure we get the request versus never getting it at all, we actually only have one required field on our create screen, and that's the summary field. We often get more information than just that because we have those fields here where you can use them, but seeing fewer of those little red asterisks actually help really alleviate concerns with users opening the create screen and just being daunted by having to fill out a bajillion required fields. There are also some other paths that we could have tried, and we actually did try some of these things, or we've thought about doing some of these things, but we actually didn't ultimately do ourselves. We could have implemented an internal Jira Service Desk. We use Jira Service Desk for several other functions within our organization already. And then we could point users to that portal instead and go create requests for our team there. But in our case, most of our stakeholders and our users are actually using Jira software and already are in there every day because they use it to help build our product. So it's just easier for them to hit the create button at the top of the navigation bar and fill out a form there. We could also use the behaviors module that comes with script runner to hide, show, or require fields based on whether or not the user is on our team. But we found that the current message field that we have on the create screen itself is clear enough, and if we can avoid introducing any performance dip that might come along with the behaviors module, we'd rather do that instead. So something we're planning on doing is actually creating a separate issue type for a new Jira project request. because it's actually a pretty common request that we get from our stakeholders. Once we do that, we can actually introduce some additional automation using a workflow post function or an automation rule like you see here, using automation for Jira to leave a comment that has a link to a Confluence page to ask the user to stimulate ideas of what they actually need to provide to us when they are requesting a new project, whether that be workflows, custom fields, that kind of thing. So all of that configuration is just for one simple create screen in one project. So there's definitely some effort involved in putting this together, but the trust that we've been able to build with our users and stakeholders has been incredible just on the ease of use of this alone. So I highly recommend taking some of these ideas and seeing how they can apply to you and your teams. Now with that said, let's get back to the scenario at hand. Now that we've received the new project request, we'll need to chat with that person or that team filing this request. When discussing a new Jira project, we generally ask two non-technical and tool-agnostic questions to start the conversation. What processes do you want to track? And what are your data points? Based on the answers to these questions, we can usually get a pretty good idea of what we need to implement for that team. During this conversation, especially with teams who are super new to Jira, I also generally discuss the default configurations we set up in new projects, like our custom default permission configurations. We're big fans of working iteratively to avoid working on something that might not work as intended or something might not get used at all, and we spend all that time and it's worth nothing. So we generally recommend starting with these as default and then introducing changes as you actually need them. For these default permission configurations, I usually break this down by talking about three general different types of users that we will have on a project. And this is actually how we break down our basic project roles, too, within our project configuration. So first, we have project administrators. These users have elevator rights on the project and can control things like project role membership, create new components and versions, and things like that. This is usually reserved for team leads in our case. We then have another project role for team members. So these users can be assigned to issues, they can work on issues, execute workflow transitions, etc. And then finally, we have a general users project role, which we always recommend to be all users who have a license to use Jira. These users have the ability to create new issues in the project, they have browse permissions, they can comment on things, watch them, and also have the ability to edit things. We prevent users from being able to assign issues out to people on the team because we don't believe that users should dictate who on that team should be working on something, and they also can't execute workflow transitions. We use this breakdown of user types per project because we want to trust users and empower them to do what they need to do. But of course, we have to do this within reason. But there's nothing more frustrating as an end user to try to do something you know is possible in a tool, and then you're prevented to do it just because there's some barriers or poor configuration in place. There's an audit trail in Jira for a reason, so you should let people do what they need to do. I think the only caveat here is the ability to delete issues, comments and work logs and things like that. Deleted content from Jira is not recoverable, so once it's deleted, it's gone forever. There's no logs of it or anything. So I would be really careful giving this out. I'd say reserve it for project administrators, or even just leave it for global Jira administrators to help with housekeeping and cleanup if you need to do that. So at this point, we usually have all the permissions we need to go forth and actually create the new project. This is kind of the fun part where we actually get to start poking around in Jira and actually building out the configurations for a project. So with the requirements I get from the requesting team, I generally work through considering how to optimize issue types, custom fields, workflows, and notifications. In some cases, out of the box project configurations will work just fine. They're default configurations that come with Jira for a reason. So even so, there are a lot of teams who need simpler requirements, or they have some more specific things that they need that will need to cater to them. We also have a lot of marketplace apps at our disposal, so we really need to take advantage of those and not waste the opportunities that we have by just having those installed in our instance. So the first thing I consider when building a new project is the issue types. This part's a little bit more conceptual than some of the more specific configurations I make and what I'll talk about later, but the decisions surrounding issue types impacts how I approach the rest of the configuration for a project. Each issue type should serve a purpose in the project. So when are separate issue types really needed? Generally, each separate process should have its own workflow, and a single issue type cannot have more than one workflow. So if workflow requirements deem it necessary, I'll opt for a separate issue type at that point. A good example of this would be like a bug tracking workflow versus new feature tracking. These are two different types of work that follow a much different life cycle. So the workflows for these types of work should probably be different, hence the need for separate issue types. Additionally, if you want to track different fields for different types of work, this is also a good time to break out and introduce separate issue types. An issue type can have a unique field and screen configuration, so you can customize which fields appear and which are required per issue type. To call back to my example from earlier, we're working on implementing a new issue type for users to request a new Jira project. So we can prompt users with more specific questions and help us gather requirements for new projects more effectively. But we don't want this issue type to follow a different workflow than new features. So these issues can share a workflow, but we can prompt for different fields by introducing this new issue type instead. Now, when is a separate issue type not needed? For me, if someone wants to track something separate for the sole purpose of reporting or numbers, I generally recommend against a separate issue type for this. In most cases, those reporting requirements don't really require, they don't require additional custom fields or a separate workflow, and there are usually better ways to get the reporting that you need, through other methods. On our own team, for example, we have several smaller sub-teams that we, assign to issues using the component field. Our development team has its own component, the infrastructure team has its own component, and so on. So now I've seen other teams do this before, and we kind of did this ourselves, not to the extent of the whole team, but we could have technically created a separate issue type for each team. So you have like a dev task or an infrastructure task. But at the end of the day, those tasks follow the same workflow, we ask for the same fields, and we can easily filter on the associated team just using the associated component instead of having a separate issue type. All right, so now we figured out which issue types we need. We should also now have a better or a solid idea of the fields we need to prompt users for. So like with issue types, the fields you need to prompt for are generally really specific to the project you're creating. So again, these are more like conceptual questions I ask myself rather than specific actions I take when creating new fields. I actually already mentioned most of this criteria when I went through the team's intake process for new Jira projects, but here's what I generally recommend when deciding which fields to use on these issue types. So in general, I try to limit, like I said before, how many fields appear on the screen, as well as limit how many are required, especially at intake. Again, it's better to get the shell of an idea and get that request in than to get nothing at all. If the team plans on using Scrum or Kanban boards, they'll probably also want to take advantage of the inline create functionality. And requiring any field basically besides the summary basically removes this functionality and renders it useless. So our team uses a Kanban during our epic kickoff calls, and during these calls, we often brainstorm and define the stories that need to go into those epics using this inline create functionality. And then once the meetings are over, we'll go back and fill all the details that we need to once we're off the call so we don't waste everybody's time. So requiring additional fields up front would actually just have rendered this useless for us. So what about custom fields? Custom fields are awesome, and I think it's one of Jira's most powerful features, especially when you start adding marketplace apps and you get your own custom field types from those apps, like the message field I mentioned earlier. But despite how great these custom fields are, defining too many custom fields can overwhelm users when they go to create new issues. And from an administrative standpoint, too many custom fields can be a performance issue. Your instance's index will grow and grow as you create more custom fields. The administrative page for managing custom fields can take a really, really long time to load, and reindexing also takes longer as well. Now, with later, more recent versions of Jira that have come out since the version that we're on, there have been improvements to this. Like there's a custom fields optimizer, and there's also paginated custom fields from, I believe, 7.12. But it's definitely worth your while to still consider the performance optimization when creating new custom fields. But this isn't to scare you away from creating custom fields. If the business justification is warranted and whatever, create away, it's fine. But mostly it's just I wanted to point out that it's important to get a justification and ask why a field is needed. And you can probably also achieve the same result using some built-in field or some existing custom field as well. I also really value the functionality that we get out of system fields like component or fixed version, because actually there's a lot of built-in reporting that you can get out of those that you take to your advantage. And I also like having the ability to use historical JQL queries that only apply to system fields, so when or during, that kind of thing. So now we've got our issue types and custom fields defined and squared away. The next thing I think about is workflows. The great thing about Jira workflows is how customizable they are. And there are a lot of tools available to us as Jira admins to make workflows as easy to use for your teams as possible. And these are some of the things that we implemented at AppDynamics. From an overall workflow perspective, we do everything we can to allow users to get to any status at any time. We want to, we trust our users to do the right thing instead of us having to introduce barriers or gates that prevent them from doing what they need to do. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there's an audit trail here for a reason. To enable our teams to do what they need to do at any time, we generally have a global transition to all of our statuses so users can get to each of them at any point they want. So this is an example of a workflow that our engineering teams use every day in their issues and their projects. You can see that all statuses can be gotten to at any point. So additionally, we've actually created some conditions on each of these global transitions using a script runner condition to hide the transitions that point back to the current status that the issue is in. So like if you're in the open transition, there's no transition to go back to the open status because you're already there. So this actually helps reduce the number of options available to a user when they want to navigate the workflow using like the workflow buttons when viewing an issue. Also, the resolution is set automatically using a post function when closing out these issues. And for any status that's not considered a closed status, there's a global transition, like on that global transition, we also clear out the resolution value automatically as well. So as you can also see in this workflow, we've created sort of an ideal path that this workflow follows. There's a specific transition between each status in addition to the global status. Because like in this workflow's case, 90% of the tickets follow the same ideal path, with variations only occurring occasionally. So we make it easier to follow that ideal path by creating separate transitions between each status and list those transitions first when choosing workflows or choosing your workflow options. On a related note, if you aren't using the OpsBar sequence property on your workflow transitions, I highly encourage you to start doing this. This property allows you to organize your workflow transitions in any order that you want them to appear in. I tend to order them in the order of that ideal path, or the most used versus like the least used, a combination of the two usually. I also like to use values in factors of 10. So as you can see here, when creating a new workflow. So if I ever have to introduce a new status or I want to insert a transition somewhere else in there, I don't have to go through and renumber all of them. If I just want to put in between the 10 and the 20, I can put in a 15. It's really easy for me to just insert it there without having to go do a bunch of work later. I also tried to do everything possible to avoid ambiguities or overlap in status names. The workflow that our engineers used before the one that you just saw, it had 3 statuses for indicating that the issue was in some sort of review process. Ready for review, in review, and approved. So you can easily differentiate between these 3 states within one in review status. If something is ready for review, you could be in the in review status and the issue is just unassigned. If it's approved, then why not just go ahead and go into the next status, which in our case is closed. There's no need to have someone to go back and click through to go and actually close it out and put it in a new status. This isn't always going to be the case. You don't always have to consolidate statuses like this, but it's just like with custom fields, it's always important to ask why and have a business justification for it. And if it does, add it. It's fine. If you do decide to prompt users to input a resolution instead of setting it automatically in the workflow, workflow transitions actually have a nifty property called jira.field.resolution.include. I learned about this probably only like 3 or 4 months ago. But this actually allows you to show particular resolution values that apply to only that workflow, that issue type, or that project. Resolutions in Jira are global values. So with this method, you can define as many resolutions as you want globally as your stakeholders ask for them, but you can just hide irrelevant resolutions from users who don't need to see them on particular issue types, projects, or workflows. So alternatively, if you have a couple resolution values that you want to set and you don't actually want to prompt the user for that, you can actually create separate transitions and set the resolution automatically. So this can be really useful in that the user only has to click a workflow transition button, doesn't have to deal with a pop-up to also configure which resolution and leave a comment or whatever they want to do. So after going through the decisions around which issue types to use, which fields to use, and how we set up workflows, we have a very solid foundation for our new project. The last thing I usually cover is notifications. How should users be notified of changes to an issue in this new project? In most cases, I generally just recommend a very simple default and building out more specifics from there. In our instance, all system events are set to notify the reporter, assignee, and the watcher of an issue. This generally covers most requirements that we get initially or that we ever get, and then we just kind of build and take away from there and based on how teams want to start using their new projects. And because after they start using it, they get a kind of a better sense of how they want to be notified of certain events. And every individual, I think, is different in how they want to receive notifications. Some people prefer email. Some people prefer getting notifications on whatever chat tool you use, like Slack. So there are some other more customizable options that our team actually uses that we've started to recommend to others, and some others have asked about as well, just based on their own requirements. So some of those things are, for example, our team uses the hell out of filter subscriptions to stay on top of our open work. So one example that we find super vital to our day-to-day work is like an open and unassigned filter subscription. So this subscription runs every 30 minutes during our regular business hours and sends us a list of any work that we deem open and unassigned to a subteam within our greater team. So at the most part, when there's a new issue in our project, it'll go 30 minutes without being touched. That's the longest it'll ever go. So it's going to be touched in some form or fashion, whether that's like taking action on an important bug or escalation that's come to our attention, or if it's a new feature request, that team is prioritizing and putting it in their backlog immediately. We've also installed the nextup.ai bot into our Slack workspace, which is helpful for interacting with Jira issues directly from Slack. So if the bot is actually in a channel and someone includes an issue key in their message to the channel, this bot actually returns a link to the Jira issue itself. It has a little bit of other information there as well, like the reporter and the priority. There's also an actions dropdown where you can execute workflow changes, assign the issues, and more without actually having to leave Slack itself. So if you're having a deep conversation about something, you can just do everything you need to do from there. It's really nice. We also have a Jenkins job that runs daily. So this is a virtual daily stand-up that we have that runs once in the middle of every day to let us know what everyone's working on. This script that we use it basically executes a JQL search via the REST API for each team. So it's based on some specific criteria that we've deemed, like what are you working on? What were you working on yesterday? What did you finish? What are you working on now and moving forward? And what are you blocked on? So this job actually mixed with the nextup.ai Slack bot gives us a quick but detailed view of everyone's current workload. It's also really a great way to automate doing a stand-up and getting a meeting off your calendar, no matter it's a 30-minute meeting that you would have every day. Get it off your calendar and free up some of your team's time, and they can go read this whenever they want to. In addition to those options, we're actually looking forward to the enterprise release of Jira Data Center 8.0, because one of the new features of Jira 8 is actually to enhance email notifications into batched emails, as opposed to getting an email for every single change that happens to an issue, which is daunting. You get emails for changes as small as changing a single field or adding a comment or a change of status. You get just a long thread within a single email. So within Jira 8, they put that all into one batched email. We're not on this version yet at AppDynamics, but we're hoping to take advantage of this by upgrading in the very near future. So with all these powers combined, you'll have a pretty great starting place for a new Jira project for any team. But without training and enablement in place, a lot of this work could be for nothing. All this stuff is cool and really great, but if people don't know how to use the tool or have never used it before, what good is all this work that we just put into it if they don't end up using it as intended or they just don't end up using it at all? So on top of all the best practices that we follow when setting up a new project, we also make measures to train and enable our users for success using the tool. I think the most important action that we take is a bit more of a passive action than anything, but we do our best to lead by example. I think that the example I started with of running through how someone can raise a new request to put in a new request for a Jira project kind of highlights how we try to do this. We use as many features of the tool as we can to make sure it's as easy to use as possible, as well as proving that this tool works and is incredibly powerful and useful. I can't tell you how many times we've gotten users to stop planning projects in spreadsheets and put them into a Jira project just by showing them our own team's processes and Kanban boards, which improves their ability to involve other people in their projects and allow better visibility and collaboration. We also tried to take a teach them how to fish approach for our support for the tool rather than taking the quick action and just doing something for someone because it's quicker in the moment. But because these people can do this very easily but if they don't have the training, then we're just going to keep doing those small actions over and over and over and over again, and it's ultimately going to take us more time than when we could have just taught them how to do it in the first place. So this is especially helpful for identifying and training project administrators. We actually based all of our permissions and configurations based on project roles, for example. So we can actually enable project admins to add or remove users from project roles to grant or remove certain permissions that way. If someone asks us why they can't start a sprint in their Scrum board or need to search for a particular set of issues, we take the time every time to teach those users why they can't start that sprint, and then maybe some advanced JQL techniques that they can use to really empower them to do what they need to do. The time spent empowering just one user is really completely worth the effort. That user is more likely to be a champion for you and your team and the tools that your teams support, as well as help their own teams help themselves. So to help with this approach, and in the spirit of teaching them how to fish, we actually have a dedicated Slack channel for any and all questions about the Atlassian products that we use at AppDynamics. If we've taught them how to fish correctly, users are able to help each other with questions that they put into that channel without us. They can answer their own questions without us as administrators coming in and having to answer that for them. Something we've actually just started doing recently is actually hosting a bi-weekly Atlassian office hours, which we intend to be like a part training session, part open forum to allow users to come ask questions, give us feedback, as well as give presentations on topics that every Atlassian user at AppD could benefit from. So we started this as like a weekly event, but our company already throws like a lot of these open office hour type meetings, so we changed our frequency to bi-weekly. This allows us more time also in between to focus on quality over quantity, so it allows us to put together presentations for each meeting and have them be more meaningful and add more value to those events. So to help us start these office hours, we completed quite a few interviews with people we thought might be attending these more often to kind of get an idea of like what they want to hear about and the topics they think that might be useful to them and their teammates. With that interview data, we started these office hours back in January. We host these generally on Tuesdays and generally send out the communications like a few days before, like the Friday before, so they can digest it over the weekend before the meetings, and the information about the topic that we're presenting on in that email as well. And we've included topics like Jira keyboard shortcuts, advanced JQL trainings, things like that. We also record all of these meetings using our WebEx tool, and then we store these recordings with a link in one of our Confluence pages and within our team space, and we allow users to go view those at a later time. So it's also like a really great way to build your own like a training repository very easily, very naturally too. And so far, we've had like a really, really, really good response to these. And we actually plan on extending this out to more of like a listening tour where we'll actually go out and seek problems from users rather than hoping that they just come to us. Some of the biggest problems that your organization might face probably doesn't get told to you because it's from people who maybe aren't as vocal as others. So it's important to go seek out and get your problems as well instead of just waiting for people to come to you with problems too. So just like the people who helped me expand my horizons and leave behind my toddler-like food palette, I try to take some similar approaches in how I help people learn a new tool like Jira. I try to make Jira as easy to use as possible, build trust with my stakeholders, and remember to have patience. Patience is huge. I've never thought that force-feeding works. There's usually some sort of resentment at the end of the day when you force someone to do something they don't want to do. People are reluctant to change, But if you take the time to show them how something new can improve their lives for the better, I think that people will, generally eventually come around. So thank you for your time today. I'm going to open it up for the last few minutes for questions. I do want to give a huge shout out to my team. This isn't, it takes a village to do this stuff. This isn't all just my ideas. We work together, and I would not be here without them. So thank you to you guys for coming today, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
So one of your best practices that you talked about was limiting the required fields on the create screen, and my heart rate went up a little bit because I'm sure other people have this problem too, but if we don't get everything we need right at the start, we can't start working on whatever they're requesting, right? And then you have to go back to them and you wait and but they expected you to start working on it at the create date. So how do you get around that? Like, what are your metrics for, because we have to report on like create to complete. And if we can't start for a few days, but it's because they didn't give us the information. How do you tackle something like that?
Sure, yeah, and it's definitely a balance too. Like, I mean, we don't approach every single project that way. It's usually just a starting point for us. But generally, if people do need required fields, we still try to limit it to some sort of minimum. I don't have any like specific metrics for you to share, but in my philosophy, I really would rather get that request because it's not your fault that you didn't get the information that you asked for. You can ask for it in a field and just leave it, optional. But they're the ones who didn't provide the information to you. So having a resolution prolonged because they didn't provide that to them, that should be on them, in my opinion. I know that's not always the case, but there usually is a lot of back and forth. But I usually just tend to do required fields in moderation, for sure. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Thanks for speaking. So I think your advice makes a lot of sense for like an in-house solution where your users are working for the same company as you are. I'm a consultant, so a lot of times I have to try and convince my clients that Jira is a good idea. So how might you change your advice or try and advocate the adoption of Jira for a client that you're working on for a specific project?
Yeah, so a lot of the work I do is internal, but I think in those cases, if you're able to, if you have any solid use cases or like scenarios that you've proven to work with other clients, if you can form any sort of like reports or metrics around that, being like, here's a case where we did use Jira and all of these processes that we implemented versus when we didn't do that, and kind of compare and contrast the two, I think that's probably a good starting place for something like that. That's what I would recommend, yeah.
Great talk. A lot of the same conclusions over the last few years as a Jira admin. How do you recommend that people set up their projects? Where I'm at, we've got a lot of projects that have existed for years, and now it's starting to pose a lot of problems around pulling things into boards.
Pulling things into boards?
Yes. So the challenge is that people are not sure which team or piece of software a given issue will relate to when it comes in, so they just kind of bring it into a triage project, and then maybe it gets moved, maybe a new issue gets created. There's just a ton of confusion around how should the projects be aligned, by the team that's going to do the work, by the piece of software that's going to take the fix.
Sure. Yeah, that's a problem that we face too. I call it project sprawl. We have too many projects that it's not clear exactly where an issue should live, kind of thing. So that's actually something that we're working on now to help consolidate and work with our product organization to help consolidate too. It's definitely something that you should review more often than not. It's a question you should ask yourself, as just saying like let something go stagnant for 5-10 years, and because 5-10 years you're not going to have the same product setup or the same project structure. So it's going to constantly evolve and things like that. There's different definitions you can give for a Jira project. Like it can be like for our team internally, it's a space where our team can work. But in some cases, a project might represent a deliverable product that has versions with it too. So there's just different ways to define a project. So I think it's very particular to each use case. It's just important to ask yourself, okay, what does a project mean for us, for this group of people? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bonnie from Collins Aerospace. Great talk, lots of great tips, learned something new today. When it comes to notifications, I was wondering if you've considered modifying or having multiple notification schemes. We have a lightweight notification scheme and a heavy one, and so that way we don't get notifications for every single edit of every field.
Yeah, generally, yeah. So that usually what I mentioned up here is definitely like the starting place. And if we want a new one, we either scrap that entirely and create a whole separate new one, or copy that default template and then just build off from there. So it just depends on the use case for that particular team in that case, yeah.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Feel free to find Alex after, and don't forget to rate the sessions on the app. And hopefully we'll see you all at Bash. Thank you.